Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a privilege to be the appetizer to this panel, and the main course will follow after my presentation. So, as Sarah indicated, I have a background in impact evaluations. I'm an economist by training. I've spent some time in the academia. I continue to be a researcher. I worked with the World Bank until fairly recently, also here in Bulgaria, and it's very nice to be back in Bulgaria. Collaborated with Sarah and the colleagues in this panel on a particular project that we'll talk about at the end of my presentation, and hopefully also have an opportunity to talk in the panel a little bit more. I also am a father of two children of preschool age, two girls, 3 and 5. So if I sound a little bit biased over the course of this presentation, you know why. The title of my presentation, and I should not look here, I should look here because I don't speak Bulgarian, my apologies, is How to Invest Early: Science and the Investment Case. And basically, I would like to highlight over the course of the presentation kind of two parts. The first one is about the science behind the investment case for early childhood development. So what has science told us over the years about the reasons for investing early? And I will highlight some concrete examples of that, and particularly with an eye towards disadvantaged children. And then secondly, to talk a bit more generally about the role of science and impact evaluations in understanding how to invest, not just at the early ages, but throughout children's development in school. So what are some of the techniques that researchers are using to answer some of those questions? How to distinguish good and effective programs from those that are less effective? What are the methods that we're using, and why are we using these? Because as you'll see, in some cases, it's quite costly to do so. It can be very time-consuming. So why do we go through the efforts of doing what we'll talk about in more detail, impact evaluations? So that will be the second part, and that will also lead us to a concrete example of an impact evaluation that we've been working on over the last couple of years in collaboration with the America for Bulgaria Foundation, the Trust for Social Achievement, and the colleagues that have been really on the implementation side of the program. So the first part is, what have we learned from the science about investing early? And I just want to show you a few examples from different countries, poor and rich, that compare on different dimensions early childhood development, comparing children from disadvantaged backgrounds with children from less disadvantaged backgrounds. The first example I want to share with you is from Madagascar. And what you see here is a comparison of children of two types of children. The first one are children from educated mothers, and the second type of children from uneducated mothers. And then we have two dimensions of early childhood development. The first one on the left is a measure of sustained attention, and the second one on the right, the two panels on the right, is about receptive vocabulary. And just to give you the example here, in this particular one, so here you see this dark line at the bottom are children from uneducated mothers. The dotted line at the top are children from educated mothers, and it's about their receptive vocabulary. The dimension here is time. And so you see that there's a gap at the beginning, and the beginning here is at 36 months, so when the children are 3 years of age. So you actually see already at 3 years of age, you see that there's a gap, in this case receptive vocabulary, between disadvantaged and not disadvantaged children. That gap grows further until about the age of 6, and then stays stable for the remaining years. So there's already a gap arising at very early years, and then in this case at the age of 6, that gap persists throughout. And so whether you are someone working in kindergarten or you're working as someone in, say, primary school or beyond, that gap matters because these are the children that you have in your classroom. So that's an example from Madagascar. Here are 4 examples from Ethiopia, India, Peru, and Vietnam, where we compared the language performance of children 5 and 6 years old. And you see, for a given country, let's take Peru, you see 5 numbers. Each number represents a type of child by their socioeconomic background. And so the top number represents the children that are in the top 20% by socioeconomic status. The bottom number here represents children that are in the bottom 20% by socioeconomic status. And so what we see here is that by the age of 5, 6, there's already a very big gap in language performance. You see it in Peru, but you also see it in the other countries. An example from Europe, Slovakia. Here we're comparing, again, 2 types of children. In many ways, actually 2 types of disadvantaged children. Both are children from Roma communities in Slovakia. The difference between these 2 types are that the red bars represent children whose mothers did not go through special education. They went to primary school. They may have completed primary school. They may have not completed primary school. And the blue bars are children whose mothers were streamed into special education. And we're comparing here children between the ages of 3 and 6. And along different dimensions, whether it's literacy, whether it's numeracy, or measures of social-emotional development, you see a gap between these 2 types of children already between the ages of 3 and 6. These 2 types of, in many ways, disadvantaged children, some more disadvantaged than others. And lastly, the 4th example from the United States. So there's a well-known study that showed that by the time children are 3 years old, those from economically better off families know on average about 1,100 words, compared with children from disadvantaged families, lower socioeconomic status, that know on average 500 words. And so when researchers started digging deeper, so what is driving that difference, one of the starking things that they found was that by the age of 4, those from economically disadvantaged children had heard 30 million fewer words. And so the parent-child interactions were very different from children in socioeconomic advantage and socioeconomic disadvantage, leading to this gap already by the age of 3. And so it's findings like these that have put increased attention on the importance of investing early. Because some of these gaps in early childhood development, they're there by 3, they may even increase until the age of 6, 7, and then they tend to persist in the data that we see. And so then it becomes much harder to address these gaps through primary and secondary education. And so you see, this is a study from neuroscience where they actually looked at volume of brain development. And even there you see differences in this particular study between, in terms of brain volume, between children from advantaged and disadvantaged. And so many of you may have seen this particular slide, which effectively makes the case, everything that I showed is kind of summarized in this slide. So what does it say? it looks at a child's brain development. Kind of when is the brain developing? When is the brain actively changing over time? And then we see three different lines here. We see a dotted line, we see a thin line, and we see a thick line. The dotted line represents the part of the brain that deals with seeing and hearing. The thin line deals with language development, and the thick line deals with cognitive development. On the x-axis, you see years. So at the end, 16, and then actually starting prenatally when we look at the months of birth. And what do you see there? What are some of the messages that are coming out? So basically, when you look at the development of the brain, much of it is actually happening in these early years until age 3, particularly when it comes to hearing and seeing. Also, language development and cognitive development most of the action happens in the beginning, although it continues through the later years as well. And that's why you may have heard the saying, well, the first 1,000 days, effectively the first 3 years of life, are a window of opportunity to invest. And so what are some of the key drivers that science has told us about early development, about early brain development? 3 in particular come out in the literature. The first one is about nutrition. The second one is about stimulation in the broad sense, so not just, say, numeracy and literacy, but stimulating children in a variety of different ways. And then the third one is about love and protection, to protect children against adversity and stress. So, for example, there's a growing literature on the negative effects of stress on children's development. So nutrition feeds the brain and promotes optimal growth. And 1/4 of children in the world under the age of 5 are affected by stunting, which is closely related to nutrition. Early stimulation affects the brain, and here are some nice scans that show kind of where and how of 4 different types of stimulation. So the top one shows the part of the brain that gets activated when a child is viewing words. The one on the right, on the top, is the part of the brain that gets activated when a child is listening to words. The part of the brain that gets activated when the child is speaking words. And here, when the child is making verbs. So you see here that different parts of the brain get activated, and as a result, synapses develop at an early age. And then lastly, what I mentioned earlier about the love and protection that protect against the negative impacts of stress and adversity. And so examples of stress and adversity are prolonged hunger, domestic violence and abuse, and violent conflicts. I'm not claiming that all of these apply, of course, here in Bulgaria, but just to give you an overview of the types of things that affect brain development globally. And then the last point about stress and nutrients. Stress increases cortisol, and that can have, over a longer period of time, can have chronic effects on brain development, and can also limit your ability to take in nutrients. We've heard this morning in the previous panel a number of statistics around adversity, around disadvantages. For example, the PISA results were mentioned a number of times. And so basically the key message there is that Bulgaria, when you look at the statistics when it comes to education, here are also some statistics mentioned about nutrition outcomes and preschool. There are some big challenges. There are some big challenges that put children from disadvantaged families at a disadvantage in terms of their development. And so, key question: we've seen that the science indicates, shows that there's this window of opportunity in the early years. We've spoken about the drivers of early childhood development: nutrition, stimulation, adversity, stress. And so where do we find then good programs if we take these drivers into account? So one option, symbolized here, we just look under stones, metaphorically, and say, well, maybe this works, maybe that works, let's try this, let's try that. That's one way of doing it. However, reality, as we all know, is often very complex. And particularly so in the area of education. If we think of children's development, whether it's in the early years, or it's at the primary, the secondary level, or after, there are many different factors that affect that. We have, of course, the child, him or herself. We have parents. We have teachers. We have peers in the classroom. And so all of these interact. And all of these may interact with programs, kind of innovative programs that we implement in preschool or in the classroom. And so it's really hard, kind of ex ante, as we start to say, okay, well, this program will work. That program will not work. And so that's why we make the case that, hey, in order to unpack that complexity, we need some people like these two researchers that look at that complexity and try to unpack it. Now, there are various ways, of course, in which you can unpack complexity. One way is the method of impact evaluations, which asks the question, okay, if you have a particular program, for example, teacher training, which will be a discussion this afternoon, what is the impact of teacher training on, of course, on teachers, on teacher behavior, and ultimately on the children in the classroom? So what is the impact of teacher training on children's outcomes? And how much does that cost? And how does that compare, for example, to a program of doing remedial education? How does remedial education impact children's outcomes? And how much does that cost? And how does that compare to investing resources in the early years? So these types of questions, rigorous impact evaluations, can help us answer. And before we go into the method and through a particular example, let me just tell you an anecdote on how they've been used. And also why you see over the last, say, 20, 15 years that there is a big increase globally in the use of these impact evaluations, and many of which are randomized controlled trials, to inform policy. So I just want to share with you one anecdote, which was told by a professor at Berkeley called Paul Gertler, who was also very active in this particular field. So Paul received a phone call. This was sometime in the mid-1990s. And so Paul sits in his office at Berkeley University in California. He gets a phone call. He picks up and he says, Paul Gertler. And on the other end of the line is somebody calling from Mexico, from the Mexican government, and ask Professor Gertler, do you speak Spanish? And Paul says, no, sorry, I'm really sorry, but I don't. And then the person from the Mexican government says, well, perfect, then you're our ideal candidate. Why? Because at that time, the Mexican government, the Ministry of Social Protection, was expanding a program called Progresa, Some of you may have heard of this. It was a program that provided conditional cash transfers to poor families, where the condition was that the children, the condition for receiving these allowances was that children would go to school and that the families would seek health services when needed. And so that was a sensitive program because it was costly. So the Mexican government actually was really keen to find out, is this program working or not? And they'd seen that Professor Gertler had been doing these impact evaluations, and they thought, well, he might be the right person. He also has no, as Americans say, no skin in the game in terms of the outcome. He's not from Mexico. He's a university professor. And so they started collaborating. The results of this impact evaluation were coming out shortly after the results of a presidential election. And actually, the president at the time, Mr. Vicente Fox, was really campaigning, the candidate, the opposition candidate, was really campaigning against this program. And he made a campaign promise that said, if I become president, then I will abolish this program called Progressa. Now, Mr. Fox was actually elected president, and then sometime later, the results of this impact evaluation came out and actually showed that the program was effective. It was effective in increasing participation in school. And so, Mr. Fox, as a politician who keeps his word, he abolished, indeed, Progressa, but only in name, and called it Oportunidades, and then scaled up the program. And so I highlight that as an example where rigorous, kind of neutral evidence can inform policy discussions, regardless of where you stand politically. It can inform a discussion about something that we all deeply care about, including in the area of education. So what is that evidence telling us when it comes to early childhood development? And so the findings from the international literature kind of broadly show that quality, however you define that, kind of high-quality interventions in the area of early childhood development tend to have a positive impact, but not always. And it's not always when people start looking digging a bit deeper. It's really about the quality of the programs that seems to stand out. So just say investing early with a program is no guarantee that you're actually able to improve children's developmental outcomes. The quality of the program, which should be as no surprise to you, really matters. And there's an example that I highlight here from Quebec in Canada, where they expanded childcare programs, made it universal, and they found that actually making it universal had two effects. On the one hand, it increased female labor force participation, so women entered the labor market as the families were able to put the children in childcare arrangements. But looking at many of the children's outcomes, there were quite a few actually negative, because it had affected the child-parenting interaction. And so, that was useful for policymakers to think about, okay, so then we need to pay careful attention in these childcare centers on, are we providing quality? And we should also reach out to the parents and say, well, make sure that, in many ways, the childcare arrangement is no substitute, so to say, for the investments that you make as parents in your children. Another kind of finding to highlight from the literature is that, yes, you see in a number of programs that had long-term follow-ups, so where the researchers were able to follow up children that benefited from an early intervention and were able to follow them up as adults, they find positive outcomes in a range of areas: health, employment, criminal behavior, for example. But when they look at the drivers, so what was it about the early interventions that caused the increase in these positive later life outcomes? A particular example of a famous program in the States, the Preschool program, Heckman and colleagues, Heckman is the Nobel Prize winner in economics, found that it's not actually gains in intelligence, in IQ, that caused these later life outcomes, but rather this Preschool program improved a number of personality skills, including academic motivation. And those improvements in personality skills led to these improvements in later life outcomes. So quality matters, and we should take a kind of holistic approach to the various dimensions. It's not just about numeracy and literacy, but also about, for example, executive function and other personality dimensions that matter. So now here in Bulgaria, so over the last couple of years, and I'll conclude with this, over the last few years, we've been collaborating, and when I say we, it was on my side, this initiative was initiated when I was still at the World Bank, and we collaborated with the Trust for Social Achievement, which is under the America for Bulgaria Foundation, the Ministry of Education, and many municipalities, and nearly 24 NGOs here in Bulgaria, on a project that tried to increase preschool participation for disadvantaged children here in Bulgaria. And so the question that was asked, kind of, what could work to improve preschool participation of disadvantaged children? Could it be, for example, increasing awareness among parents of the value of sending your child to preschool? Maybe that can really boost preschool participation. Maybe parents are simply not aware. They haven't seen this presentation. Or maybe it's about affordability. Poor parents would love to send their children to preschool, but they simply can't afford it. Or maybe there's more to it. Maybe it's an issue of affordability and also behavioral dimensions. For example, if you're poor and you have other things on your mind, how to survive from a day-to-day basis, for example, then perhaps a conditional cash transfer program, like the example that I provided in Mexico, perhaps that can boost the preschool participation. So a few years ago, we set out to design this program together, implement it, and do this rigorous impact evaluation to find out. Now, the results of the study will come out in a few months, so I should say that right away that unfortunately we don't have them to share yet, but they will be out very, very soon. And so we worked across Bulgaria in 236 localities. So in 236 localities, these were poor communities. The Trust for Social Achievement, with the support of nearly 24 local NGOs and the municipalities, implemented this program, which had these different components. These 4 different components: awareness raising, removing the fees, also the hidden fees, parents receive support, and these conditionalities. And we created different groups. So in some of these communities, there was just awareness raising. In some of these communities, there was just removing the fees. And in some of these communities, there was a mix of both. And we wanted to know which one of these is most effective at increasing preschool participation. And so then, from an evaluation point of view, so how do you do that? Which community gets which intervention? How, and does that matter? For example, let's say we are just interested in knowing the impact of increasing awareness, could we select 30 communities, carry out a baseline survey to see what share of children are in preschool, launch our awareness-raising campaign, and come back a year later or 2 years later and see, has there been an increase in preschool participation? That would be one way of trying to answer this question, does awareness-raising lead to an increase? And imagine that we see, indeed, preschool participation after the awareness-raising is now much higher than before. And imagine that I present the results as the researcher at the Ministry of Education. And they will ask me, but Mr. Joost, aren't you aware that there have been many developments here in Bulgaria around preschool? And so you tell me that there's been an increase in preschool participation in these 30 communities, and that's the result of your awareness-raising campaign. But what about the other things that were going on? Now, municipalities were doing many things. Right? We also just changed the law. And so how can you be sure that it's because of the awareness-raising and not because of other things that were going on at the same time? And then I would have to answer, I can't be sure, sorry. Now, because of that, we didn't take this approach. We actually worked with a comparison group, or also sometimes called a control group. And again, then there's the question of control group. So what is a control group or a comparison group? Is a set of communities that does not receive, in this case, the awareness-raising campaign. And then you're also faced with the question, how do you select your comparison group? So imagine that TSA, the Trust for Social Achievement, would have asked the NGOs, well, why don't you select 30 communities that will receive the awareness-raising campaign? And then, I'm sure the NGOs could have come back and said, well, here are 30 communities. They are all excited to participate in the awareness-raising campaign. The mayors are really motivated. And so again, we then collect preschool participation in the communities that are about to receive the awareness-raising, and in the communities, the control communities that are not. We follow them up over time, and we find that in the communities that received the awareness-raising campaign, preschool participation increased by more than in the control communities. Again, I present my results to the ministry, and then the ministry officials say, but Mr. Joost, you just told me that the NGOs selected the communities and that the mayors were really excited about the awareness-raising campaign. And so how can you be sure that it's the awareness-raising campaign that was really effective, or perhaps you were just selecting winners. You were selecting communities that were already boosting preschool in other ways. And I have to say, sorry, I can't be sure, and I should have done something differently. So we also did not take that approach. So what we did was a randomized controlled trial, where at one of the hotels here in Sofia, the Trust for Social Achievement and the participating NGOs and the 236 municipalities that were invited and that had consented to participate, there was a lottery. A lottery was organized where literally, you see the lady blindfolded, was taking communities, selecting communities, and okay, this community received this intervention and this community received that intervention. So why did we do that? Well, as a result of giving everyone an equal chance, giving every community had an equal chance. As a result of doing that, the different groups, and so here, for example, you see a group of 29 communities that received the awareness-raising campaign and no financial intervention. So we had all these different groups. As a result of giving every community an equal chance and doing a lottery, all the communities started off being equal. They had similar, each group had a similar starting point when it comes to preschool participation, were similar in the average motivation of the parents, of the mayors, etc., etc. So everyone had the same starting point. The only difference now between these groups was that, say, one group received the awareness campaign, another group received the remove the cost of preschool. And so, because they all started off being the same, and the only thing that is different is the intervention, and we can come back, and we did that, so we started with a baseline, and then we came back and saw where they were at the end of the year. We could come back and actually collect information on preschool participation, on children's development outcomes. And if we see differences now, we can go back to the ministry and say, preschool participation is higher because of this particular intervention, and not because they were more motivated or because there were other things going on at the same time. So by doing this lottery effectively and giving every community an equal chance, you're able to say definitively the changes that you see in children's outcomes are the result of the intervention and not because of something else. And so when you look at the literature, it's these types of results that are being used to inform kind of what is working and what is not working. So just to conclude, this is one example of an evaluation where the evaluation component was actually financed by the World Bank through a program called the Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund, which until I left the World Bank late last year, that's the program that I was managing. And that program has over 60 of these types of impact evaluations going on around the world that are asking that are trying to answer critical policy questions, particularly in the area of early childhood development and education. And they collectively will contribute to a body of work that will allow, in this case, Bulgaria, but also in other countries, to inform the key policy questions that the countries are facing in a neutral, unbiased way. Thank you very much.